everyone, Ryan Young, Kama Jiu-Jitsu. Dr. Dean did what turned out to be a wildly popular video for the channel based on his conversations on judo and his experiences. So being that he is a professor in a university and he is a history buff on judo and jiu-jitsu, we figured why not do something different from his perspective and have him do a history video on judo, which would kind of go nicely with our jiu-jitsu history video. But before we get started, I want to thank you guys all for subscribing, for liking, for all the whole drill and the commenting. The comments are very valuable to us. Also, for those of you that have signed up for our Patreon channel to get the techniques that Professor Dave does, the old Rickson Gracie Invisible Jiu-Jitsu, that channel is actually doing very well thanks to you guys. I think as far as jiu-jitsu goes, I think it's probably the most popular channel on Patreon, and we want to thank you for that. For those who are wondering where the channel is, go ahead and hit the link that we'll put up, and it'll take you right there. So anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to, let me just kind of back away and we'll have Dr. Dean come in and finish up for you.
All right, so a few weeks ago, we did a video in which I shared some of my experiences training in judo and then subsequently picking up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu here at Kama. And I gave some of my thoughts on training in judo, training in Jiu-Jitsu, the relative strengths of each. And a lot of people watched that video. So we got a number of views and a number of comments. So thanks for watching and thanks for your feedback. So what Ryan and I thought we'd do today is to sort of expand on some of the points that we covered in the first video. And I want to do it by way of a lesson in the history of judo. And I think by doing that, we can sort of discuss a couple of themes that came up in the last video and are things that really come up a lot in this channel. The first is a relationship between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and judo, how they relate to each other, where they came from. And then this, constant discussion about a sport-oriented training method versus a more self-defense or well-rounded training. So we have to start in the history of judo in Japan. And Japanese jiu-jitsu originally was taught to the samurai as a method of unarmed combat. So in addition to learning sword fighting and archery, weapons of various sorts, the samurai also trained in jiu-jitsu, which was an unarmed system of combat. In 1868, Japan enters an important period in its history, the Meiji Era. And in the Meiji Era, Japanese society is rapidly modernizing, Japan is industrializing, and part of that meant modernizing its military. And this meant that there was no longer a need for a professional warrior class. So a lot of the rights and the privileges of the samurai went away, and the samurai art of jiu-jitsu started to go into decline. Jiu-jitsu became known or started to get a reputation as something that sort of thugs and brawlers participated in. So into this enters Jigoro Kano, or Kano Jigoro. And Kano was a small man. He was about 5'2", he didn't weigh a whole lot, and as a kid he was bullied and picked on quite a bit. So he decides to learn jiu-jitsu as a means to defend himself. So first he studies a style known as Tenshin Shinyo. So Tenshin Shinyo Ryu is the first style that Kano studies under a master by the name of Fukuda. And Fukuda dies, so Kano continues to study Tenshin Shinyo under a different master, and that second master dies. So then Kano begins to pick up Kito Ryu, a different style of jiu-jitsu. And I should note that even after Kano founds the Kodokan and develops judo, he continues to study, practice, and teach Kito Ryu. He didn't really see this as a sort of a split, but he continued to study jiu-jitsu, and not just these two styles, but Kano searched broad and wide for knowledge about jiu-jitsu and about the samurai arts to develop skills to incorporate into his own style. So he sought knowledge far and wide, and he took the best techniques, the things that he thought were most effective, and the training methods that he thought were most effective, and he developed judo. So in 1882, Kano creates the Kodokan. And this is the first judo school. And at the time, there was only a few people that were that were practicing it. Why did he change the name from Jiu-Jitsu, which is what he'd studied, which is what he'd practiced, to Judo? The first character in both arts is the same. Whether you spell it J-I-U or J-U, Ju is the same kanji in Japanese, and it implies soft or gentle or flexible. But whereas Jitsu is a skill to be learned, a skill or an art, Judo implied a path or a complete way of life. So in addition to just skills that the samurai would use for fighting, for unarmed combat, Judo implied a means of self-defense, of physical education, of mental training, and also had a moral code behind it. The other thing that differentiated Judo from the older styles was that Judo, Kano emphasized, could be practiced by anybody. Young, old, men, women, samurai, commoners, and also foreign students. So a number of foreign students studied at the Kodokan initially. Jigoro Kano was also a school teacher. He worked in the Ministry of Education, and he promoted the teaching of Judo in schools. So to this day, Judo is part of the physical education curriculum that's taught in Japanese schools. And he also taught women, and this is a big deal as well, given the time period that we're talking about. Indeed, one of his students was Keiko Fukuda, and Keiko Fukuda was the granddaughter of his first jiu-jitsu instructor. She has a really interesting history. Keiko Fukuda eventually moved to the United States, where she taught judo in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she became the first woman to receive the 10th Dan black belt. She has a very interesting story. Definitely look her up. So what is judo? Kano was, he was a person that thought very systematically about the martial arts, and he divided the techniques of judo into three broad categories. The first is nagewaza, and nagewaza are the throws of judo, the thing that most people associate with judo, the big throws. The second is katamewaza, and these are grappling techniques, so things like pins and submissions of various sorts, chokes and joint locks. Some of this can be practiced standing up, so you can choke standing or do arm lock standing, but a lot of it's practiced on the ground, so ground fighting is known as newaza. And then the third is atemiwaza. And atemiwaza is striking. And a lot of people are surprised to learn that judo has strikes in it. But if you look at the early judo texts and manuals, including the one that Kano himself wrote, atemiwaza is included as part of the curriculum. But there are also two different training methods in judo. The first is randori, and randori is like free sparring, in which two contestants are going at each other with more or less full speed and full power, trying to get the other person to the ground and then submit them. There's also kata, and kata is the sort of formal, prearranged, choreographed sequence of moves in which your partner is not fully resisting. Kano forbade some of the more dangerous techniques from being used in randori. So striking, for example, is not included in randori. And some of the more dangerous techniques like, say, throws from wrist locks are not allowed in randori, sort of things that you'd see in Aikido. So there's randori and there's kata as the two principal training methods. So how did jiu-jitsu, or how did judo spread within Japan and become the popular martial art in Japan that it is today? In 1886, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police organized a tournament. And there's a series of tournaments after that in which they're pitting different styles of jiu-jitsu against each other to figure out which is better, which is more effective. And the Kodokan students dominate these early competitions. They do extremely well. And word spreads through these competitions about the effectiveness of judo. And the Kodokan goes from having maybe a few dozen students to having hundreds of students within a relatively short period of time. At the same time as that there are these tournaments, there are also different jiu-jitsu schools coming to the Kodokan to challenge their students in one-on-one contests. And the Kodokan students, again, typically dominate those challenge matches. There's one style, or there's one school of judo or of jiu-jitsu that judo has a hard time with. So in one of these contests, practitioners of Fusen-ryu jiu-jitsu defeat Kodokan black belts with their superior knowledge of katamewaza, or grappling, and especially ground fighting. So Kano agrees to allow to teach more ground fighting techniques at the Kodokan, brings in Fusen-ryu instructors, learns from the art, and incorporates many of their techniques into the ground fighting system of judo. And some judoka start to specialize in newaza, or ground fighting. And this becomes eventually the basis of Kosen Judo. And Kosen Judo is not necessarily a different style of judo, right? They still recognize the Kodokan and so on. It's a different set of competition rules that allow for longer time on the ground, longer time in newaza. But it's really practiced by a few schools in Japan. So how does judo then spread from Japan out through the rest of the world and become the international art and sport that it is today? Well, there's two primary means that judo spreads. The first is international students coming to the Kodokan and studying with Kano and with his other instructors. So people came from Russia, from China, from Europe, from the United States to come study this new art at the Kodokan. And one particularly notable student was a person by the name of Vasily Oshchepkov. He's a Russian, and he studies for about 10 years, I believe, at the Kodokan, and he returns to Russia, and he, with a few others, develop the martial art of Sambo. And Sambo is pretty exciting to watch, but it has its roots in Kodokan Judo. The other way that Judo starts to spread around the world is that Kano and the Kodokan send emissaries to give demonstrations all throughout the world. So Kano himself traveled many times to various countries putting on judo demonstrations, and other prominent black belts would travel to the United States, Latin America, Europe, putting on demonstrations as well. In fact, one of those delegations eventually goes to teach the US President Teddy Roosevelt judo. And in those challenge matches, oftentimes they would do a demonstration and there'd be a challenge where someone from the audience, maybe a wrestler or a boxer or a fighter of some sort, would challenge the judo delegation, the judo black belts, to a contest. And judo typically dominated, typically did quite well against those. One important delegation is led by Tsunejiro Tomita. Tomita is, I believe, the first black belt listed on the Kodokan registry. And he took over as the head instructor of the Kodokan when Kano was turning his attention to other things. So Tomita, along with two of his students, Mitsuyu Maeda and Soshihiro Satake, they first traveled to the United States, putting on judo demonstrations. Later, Tomita goes home. But Maeda and Satake continue to travel throughout the world, primarily in Latin America. They think they go to Cuba, Mexico, Central America, and they end up in Brazil, where there's a large Japanese Brazilian community. And they end up teaching the Gracies and also Luis Franca. And this would become the basis of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would come to focus more on the katamewaza, or the grappling side of judo, although, you know, I'm pretty sure they learned throwing techniques as well. If you look at the early Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu demonstration videos, there's one by Helio Gracie, and he's clearly showing skill in takedowns and throws. But over time, sort of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes to focus a bit more on katamewaza and newaza, the ground fighting, and judo sort of has a more stand-up orientation. Yeah, this delegation to the United States, they leave in 1905. And I think it's 1914 that Maeda arrives in Brazil. I'm not sure when Satake arrives in Brazil, but it's around that time. Judo, throughout the pre-World War II period, proves itself by contests with other systems of jiu-jitsu, proves itself through challenge matches with wrestlers and boxers as it starts to spread. And as they prove their effectiveness, more and more people, more and more schools start to open around the world. So the first school in the United States, for example, opens in 1903 in Seattle. You get schools opening in Europe, in Russia, throughout the world, and judo really starts to spread, but its popularity is established because of its success in these contests. So that's the pre-World War II history. And in the next video, we'll discuss what happens to judo after World War II as it becomes more of a modern Olympic sport.